Gemani die rui bechaard agus fátige roverstachige agrán iwwer a dach de dó de Blúiríní Béaloidis an pudcréile a tíocht thugah ó knúsach for the dessert and cláis na Holdschool at Blúiríní. Hello friends and welcome along to episode 42 of Folklore Fragments, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection, University College Dublin. It's a great honour for me personally, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Professor Henry Glassie, as someone whose work has had a formative and inspiring influence on my own thinking regarding folklore, folk life, the folklore archive, and about art and the role of art and beauty in human life in general. Henry, I hope you'll forgive me a moment while I read out the charges against you for the benefit...
Well, you just rip ahead and do what you want.
For the benefit of any listeners who might be unfamiliar with your work. Henry Glassie is College Professor Emeritus at Indiana University, Bloomington in the USA, has carried out fieldwork on 5 continents and written books on the full range of folkloristic interests from drama, song, and story to craft, art, and architecture. 3 of his books, Passing the Time in Ballymenone, The Spirit of Folk Art, and Turkish Traditional Art Today, have been named among the notable books of the year by the New York Times. And a very beautiful film on your work, which is directed by Pat Collins, entitled Henry Glassie Fieldwork, had its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2019. Henry has won many awards for his work, including the Charles Homer Haskins Prize with the American Council of Learned Societies for a distinguished career of humanistic scholarship, the American Folklore Society Award for a Lifetime of Scholarly Achievement, the Abbott Lowell Cummings Award of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, the Turkish Municipal Government Award of Honorary Citizenship, the Nigerian Studies Association Book Award, and most recently, on the pleasant occasion we're sitting down together today, the conferral of an honorary degree of arts from University College Dublin. Henry has had a long and extremely positive relationship with UCD since the establishment of the Department of Irish Folklore in the university here in the early 1970s, and his association with UCD has continued in more recent years following the creation in 2005 of the National Folklore Collection as a successor to the Department of Irish Folklore, which is from where we sit beaming this to you today. Henry's contribution to the discipline of Irish folklore and ethnology has been exceptional. Having lived in Ballymenone, County Fermanagh, for almost a decade in the 1970s, he published a number of studies inspired by the community there, including All Silver and No Brass in 1975, Passing the Time in Ballymenone in 1982, and The Stars of Ballymenone in 2006. These landmark works, which have become classic texts for the student of folklore in Ireland and abroad. Henry has rendered invaluable service to our understanding of Irish popular tradition and vernacular culture, and he can be truly described as a towering figure in the study of Irish folklore for more than half a century. Even in his retirement, he remains a staunch and committed friend to Ireland and to the people he worked with while carrying out fieldwork here. So, Henry, welcome. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
Pretty elaborate introduction, but I guess it isn't false.
It's all downhill from here, don't we? Throughout our conversation today, I was saying just before we started recording that I hope to invoke various friends, basically. Friends that you won't have met, but people that I count as friends who passed away before I ever met them, the likes of Sean O'Sullivan, Michael J. Murphy, Peter Flanagan, Ellen Cutler, Hugh Nolan, and others. And to start our conversation today, I want to read 2 short pieces to sort of frame a way into looking at your work in Ballymenone, essentially. And one is by Eston Evans, and the other is by Michael J. This is from Eston Evans, The Personality of Ireland, and it's just a short entry that he has that sort of, it brought your work to mind, where he's talking about geography. And he says, geography has now won almost universal recognition in the universities, though characteristically, Ireland came late in the field. And if its methodology is constantly changing, its broad concern, the aerial differentiation of the world and its peoples, has been a matter of inquiry and speculation since classical Greek times. Its immemorial symbol is the map, but although geographers like to have their fingers on the map and their feet on the ground, they cannot but be aware of the philosophical aspects of their subject, of the mystery, as well as the reality of man's place in nature. And secondary to that, I want to read a piece about taken from Michael J. Murphy's beautiful book At Sliabh Gullion's Foot, and this is a short entry he has concerning the old people, the people of the hills. He says, "The old people remain the same today as they have been for years, despite the changes which have come over the countryside, the quaint, frank, and even graphic phrasing of their idiomatic speech. the simple but deep faith which marks their activities and contacts, and the old sayings and traditions remain also. These people and their contemporaries are the real and vital keepers of tradition. When they tell one some of them old tales, they are not aware that they are doing a service to the nation and an honour to the listener. One veritably hears a breath from down the centuries, and an important breath. One hears something that has been handed down from family to family and is yet sweetly alive for all its age. And there it reposes in the mind of an old person, sitting on a low form, hugging his or her knees before the fire. It is a unique experience in an age of spurious values, of artifice and snobbish sophistication. So with those two sort of opening sort of pieces, the idea of the finger on the map and feet on the ground, and then sort of the old people and their stories, I suppose I'm wondering how, as an academic working in the US in the 1970s, did you come to be wandering around Ballymenone with a map in hand and listening to them old tales?
Like I say, it's a very interesting question, honestly. But one of the things that a lot of my colleagues have is they have an Irish background that they're aware of. And so one of the things that they would want to do when coming to Ireland is to sort of catch up on their own roots. That's not true for me. It wasn't exactly what happened with me. That is to say, it wasn't until I had already gone to Ireland and had spent years in Ireland that a great uncle of mine discovered that we did have our Irish ancestors. But so that it wasn't an ancestral matter that was exciting to me about Ireland, but it was a vital matter. And the vital matter was the result of the very people that you've just talked about. That is, those people that I happened to meet, and I happened to meet as a part of a field work that was already going, and I was well into it. So that I began my field work in basically the highlands of the United States. I wasn't thinking about anything across the great ocean. I'd not been anywhere. I'd just been right around my own home country. And so that I was interested in I was just interested in the backcountry of America. That was my first goal. And so that the first two books that I wrote were both from that source. That is to say, I traveled very widely in the eastern United States. I'd never been across the Mississippi River, but I'd been up north and seen the Yankee territory, and I was very, very comfortable in the South. And so that what thrilled me about the South was the mixture of white and black music. That is, instead of being one or the other, the fact is what the South was about to me was the integration of African and European music. And that was what was around me all the time. And very early, I was able to find great musicians in the highlands of the South. And some of them were black, and some of them were white, and some of them were male, and many of them were female. And the art that they had, the songs that they had, the music that they had, the music that ultimately became jazz in some kind of formal sense, but wasn't jazz in my place. It was just old country music. And Thea Phillips would play the banjo, and Tab Ward would play the banjo. One of them was white, one of them was black, but they played pretty much the same kind of music. And I found that was my drive. My drive was really to understand my place in terms of what's good about it and not bad about it. That's pretty simple. There's an awful lot of bad stuff you could say about the Southern United States, but there are a lot of good things you could say about the Southern United States. And so the people that with a heritage of the Civil War, I had a heritage of the Civil War. That is, I had a great uncle who was in the Confederate Army, and I had a great uncle who was not only in the Northern Army, but was the commander of an African American regiment. That's my ancestry. That's the mix. And it was a mix that was liberal and Southern at once, which doesn't seem right, but it was right. And so that's what I liked. So what happened to me, and you've got the documents right there on the table. That what happened to me is that I happened to meet Fred Niffen. Fred Niffen was a great geographer. And geography became the first framework for my understanding. That is, my emotional understanding was I like this old time music played by these old black and white folks. But what also was true is that I didn't have a framework for it. But I met Fred Niffen quite by accident. I was just at the beginning of my college career. I wasn't a graduate student even. But I met Fred Niffen, and Fred Niffen was a cultural geographer. I never thought about that, and I didn't take classes in it, but I knew him, and he was my master. Fred Niffen just told me how to go about doing serious field work. He had written a very important article on the house types of Louisiana years ago in the 30s, before I was born. And I just looked at that and I said, well, hell, that's a serious way to do things. Let's really do this information. And so I set out to do the same thing that Fred Niffen had done for Louisiana. I set out to do the same thing for Virginia, the backcountry of Virginia. And I'd never been anywhere in the world other than right there at home. Hadn't even been much traveled in America, but I really knew the South very well. I knew the kind of environment that I liked. I mean, I understood the signs on the land. This is very important for me coming to Ireland. I knew what the signs on the land looked like if you were going to find richness of art lower. And so I knew how to do that work, but I hadn't been anywhere. And the reason that I was interested in what drew me to Ireland was pretty simple. Fred Niffen's friend was Eston Evans. Eston Evans had written these really excellent books about Ireland that were general. You quoted him. And I thought Prof. Evans was great. I met him in Louisiana. I hadn't been to Ireland, but Prof. Evans came and gave a lecture in Louisiana, and I just thought he had it down. Niffen had it down. Those two guys, you understand what I'm trying to say is, I was interested in the phenomena, but I needed a pattern for the phenomenon. I need a framework for the phenomenon, and geography provided that for me. So that for me, I didn't start out with, like many folklorists do, necessarily with a kind of attraction to a particular thing. I was interested in a way to think about the world. And that way to think about the world was geographic. I wasn't smart, but I did know I did know how to go back in the backcountry. And I knew how to get along with those people, and I knew how to befriend them, and I knew how to, I had good machinery. I knew how to record music. So what happened to me was I met Prof. Evans in Louisiana. I was in school at Louisiana. I was taking anthropology classes. Prof. Evans showed up, elegant, beautiful, handsome man. He approved of the little trivial stuff that I was doing, and I said, that's a great thing. You know where I want to go? I want to go to Ireland. And so that was Prof. Evans. Not very long after that, I met Sean O'Sullivan, also when he came to lecture. So I had two human beings who framed up a kind of understanding of something that I could do in a more intellectual fashion. And so I met Prof. Evans, and I met Sean O'Sullivan. And they were both of them before I'd ever been outside of the United States. I'd never been anywhere in the world. Well, that's a slight exaggeration, but it's true that I hadn't traveled much. And then, so what happens? Evans, Sean O'Sullivan, I want to go to Ireland. Pretty much that simple.
Wow.
And it was because of those two men that I not only met, that's of course one thing, but I read all of their works. And so I really had Prof. Evans down very tightly. And the kind of framing which Fred Niffen also offered me, the geographical framing was really what was more interesting to me. Sean O'Sullivan it's a simple thing to say. Sean O'Sullivan was framed by media. He was interested in folk tales. But I really was interested in the land from the geography. And I understood from Sean O'Sullivan, and I read what he did. I'd already, before I ever saw Ireland, I wrote a really positive review of his Folktales of Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And so I admired what he did. He liked these tales. Prof. Evans and Fred Niffen gave me the kind of framework, space.
Yeah.
I was ready.
Mm.
I was ready. And so that then what happened is that because of those great men that I'd met, where I wanted to go was Ireland.
Mm.
And it wasn't the kind of sentimental thing about, the lost place.
Mm-hmm.
It was Ireland's richness. It wasn't something else. It was Ireland's richness, the obvious wealth that Sean O'Sullivan showed me in the Folktales of Ireland, the tremendous wealth that Prof. Evans showed me in his drawings of houses and so on. And, years and years and years passed. And on the one hand, I was honored to give the oration that celebrated Prof. Evans's life at Queen's. And that was a wonderful thing. But really it was, I brought him in to my heart. Really. I loved him. When I was in Fermanagh doing all this field work, I'd drive over to Belfast and visit with Prof. Evans, and I would tell him what I'd learned, and he would tell me how to think about that, and he would show me his field notes, and I would look at his field notes and realize that my field notes ought to be comparable, and that they ought to be exhaustive, but at the same time artistic. Yeah, that was a great thing that Prof. Evans offered to me, was that he was really an artist, and he was a great thinker. Mm-hmm. I'd like to say I was following in his footsteps.
That is incredible. That's amazing.
I mean, I guess I could keep going on and babble at you.
No, it's fantastic.
But that was before, you see, that's what I had an understanding of Ireland before I was in Ireland, before I'd ever seen the place. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't precisely a sentimental kind of journey for me. It was a very intellectual journey. Mm. And so I hit the ground in Ireland, and what did I do? I came here. I knew Sean O'Sullivan, so I just came here and I met Sean O'Sullivan, and you mentioned Michael J. Murphy, and I met Michael J. For a very special reason. You understand this archive in a way that I don't, but the thing that I found exciting in this archive was not the pieces of genre, but the sort of memories that were written in the books that were not the central books. The central things were the phenomena. Yeah. But what I was really interested in, what I really preferred, were the kind of the diaries.
The main collectors had to keep diaries, and Michael J.'s diaries are just unbelievable. They're incredible.
Well, that's where I started. You see, I saw Michael J. I had read At Sweet Gullen's Foot. Yeah. You quoted from it, and I'd read that. And I admired it. It was one of the books that drew me to Ireland. I mean, Michael J. Murphy's book was just, hey, that's the kind of stuff that I want to do. Yeah. But also in the archive, I met him, and we hit it off like that, just immediately. And I spent lots of times with him, and one night we had a little bit too much to drink, and we were wandering around Dublin, and neither of us knew where we were. And so we just sat on the steps of some statue of some famous person, and sobered up and had a wonderful time laughing. And so amazing. It was, he was very human, and I really liked it. I liked everybody that I met here. Yeah. But Michael J. was very special for me. And I think, like you have Tyrone Folk Quest, that's all very influential on me. Yeah. I was in the game, but I was in the game through a geographic entry more than a folkloristic entry, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. It's funny that you mentioned that about Michael J's diaries, because they're so explosive is the word that comes to mind, but I think it doesn't convey what I mean necessarily. But I've never, I feel sort of silly now saying this because it seems so obvious in hindsight. I've never put your writing or your work, even in Ballymenone, I've never automatically brought the diaries to mind, but they're really similar. Like you write, I think it's in the preface and the introduction, that this isn't a text where you can just pick out forms and neatly sort of pick out folkloristic motifs or forms from this text. And his diaries are specific. Even the fieldwork collections in the main manuscript collections as well are like that, where he'll be describing this, he'll be interviewing somebody, and then he sort of moves into describing his own inner life or his own mental state or sort of perceptions or views about the locality, or he drifts into something else and then comes back to the material in a way and back. It's this sort of, it's one whole. It's like a kind of cosmos in these texts. It's not here are the items as such. And your work is like that as well, that it's sort of fittifuti is the word in art, that these are sort of woven together in a whole kind of holistic way, I suppose. Yeah. But and with Sean O'Sullivan, then, in terms of, like, he's just a hero of mine, but what was the influence that he had on you in terms of, like, why Fermanagh as a place to go to?
Sean said Fermanagh is worthless. Sean said, "Don't go to Fermanagh. They don't have any." Yeah, literally, I was around in Ireland long enough so that, for example, we all went to academic conferences together. Mm-hmm. I mean, I did with Michael J. I did with Sean, and I got to know them in a very friendly way. But Sean O'Sullivan saw the world like shattered glass, in my feeling, that he liked the bits and shards and so on, and that's what he was after. And so that when I told him that I had, this is very, very, the beginning of my adventure. It happened to, of course, it was the bloodiest year of the Troubles. And so it isn't, you'd think, well, this is not a smart thing to do, is to go off and the back country of the borderland of Ireland. Yeah. That's a kind of a stupid idea.
Yeah.
I had 3 little kids. We all went. I wasn't worried about it. I never worried about it in a minute, because I felt that as time went on in Fermanagh, I could trust both sides. I wasn't aligned, but I could meet the radicals of both sides, and believe me, serious radicals they were, and I could talk with them. And it wasn't that I was being mealy-mouthed or kind of a coward. It's just that I knew the local rules of politics and the local rules of courtesy, and so I could just get along very well in that country. Well, I'm back to Sean O'Sullivan. He said, "Don't go to Fermanagh. They don't have any folklore." And of course, to him, that was quite linked with the Irish language. Last Irish speaker in Fermanagh died in 1923. There was nobody. People, there were inclinations in the English that were very like Irish, but I couldn't speak Irish, but nobody around me could speak Irish either. And Sean O'Sullivan found that was, he was very friendly, but that was a kind of a limitation of that kind of field location.
Yeah. I
thought if you were also interested in politics and war, that was a great place to go. It was. I first looked at Armagh, too violent at that moment. I'm talking, But I got to Fermanagh. I didn't find the violence. It just was not the same as Armagh. And so I could rent a little trailer, which is what I did. It was owned by a British soldier who didn't want to come and go fishing in Lough Erne, and with reason. But for, £6 a month, I had a little place to live with. We, used turf and so on, no electricity, but my little children loved it. They all just understood. They weren't worried about the soldiers that were coming through, and there were, sounds of bombs at night in Enniskillen. There certainly were. But they weren't worried because they knew the other kids, and the other kids would lead them into some kind of an understanding. And so that little kids were fine and grew up in that environment. And they really did, because I went for a decade. You said a decade, and that's correct. For a decade, I was doing fieldwork in Fermanagh. And I just got to know the people very well. I was perfectly comfortable with both sides socially. And that doesn't mean that I was a coward. It just meant that I didn't have to be committed. And everybody understood that. Yeah. I wasn't there's all amusing memories. Here's not amusing memories. I rented this camper from a British soldier, and as I said, it was very inexpensive. And one night, thunder at the door, the police came in and took all my field notes and took them away. And they assumed that I was running guns. Why in the world would a guy like me be in Fermanagh in that time, other than being involved? And so the supposition was that I was a gun runner from Philadelphia. I mean, after all, I lived in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia had a very strong, pro-Irish feeling. The whole city did. And so they recognized, well, Philadelphia, the guy's come from Philadelphia, he's obviously running guns, he's doing something like this. And so they came in, they took all my field notes. And they came back about a week later and they said, "You're interested in farming." Who the hell would come all the way from America and settle in Fermanagh? Yeah. Who was interested in farming? You're under arrest. And so the field notes were really full of agricultural work, because I worked with it. I mean, I did all the work, and I learned to do, handle the turf. And so they just were disappointed. What's it with a guy like you? And what I was smart enough to do in that day, and not everybody it has been proved to be smart enough to have done this. I had absolutely no information about the violence. Yeah. I knew the guys, both sides. I knew them. There's nothing in the record. Yeah. My record that anybody could take of me. This is the kind of thing that happened with the Boston College. Yeah. That all of a sudden, well, this is safe because they're not going to reveal it. Well, the police can seize it. Yeah. That's exactly what I already understood. And I already understood that because I'd worked in civil rights in America. And I knew,
what could happen.
I'd marched with the black leaders. Yeah. I knew them. And if I knew that stuff, the police would be very interested for me to write it down, and I just never did. And I knew from civil rights that would be idiotic to come to Ireland and put anything down on paper that could be used against anybody on either side. Yeah. And so they just said, "What? You come all the way from Philadelphia and live in this slummy little house, and all you're doing is talking about farming?" Yeah. Oh, man, get out of here. But ultimately the police understood that I
They
was
let you be.
not going to be talking about this
Mm-hmm.
politics, and I wasn't there to write about the troubles.
Mm-hmm.
I was there to write about human response, partially to the troubles, but as much as that to the weather.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
to the old people who know the old songs. I mean, I remember how guys who a young man who was in fact, very committed to war, and who actually was a killer. And if I'd put his name down, if I even said it now, I wouldn't do it. And so I just wouldn't say his name. But he got the message, that I was sympathetic enough to be passable, but I'm not in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It was a thing that you had to do it. And that sort of understanding of a need to be distanced at the same time that you're close.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound right, but it's actually perfectly reasonable.
Yeah.
And so I could be distanced from the political position, but not distanced from the human beings that were involved in it. And so that I was told a lot of things, that it was a very good damn thing that I didn't write them in the book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ah, it's amazing.
That in the almost the beginning of this big book is when I gave a copy to the. I gave all the books that I wrote. I gave to everybody. I mean, everybody got a copy of the book, and there were a couple of young guys said, "We just don't quite get it. Why are you writing about this? Just like the cops. Why are you writing about farming, for heaven's sakes?" And so that they thought that maybe there was some kind of secret thing that was going on in this text.
Yeah.
And so they took the text to the local priest and said, "Look, this thing is complicated, it's big and it's long and it goes on and on and on and it talks and talks and talks. What should we think about this book?" And the priest kept it for 3 months. That's what they said. And he said, "You should be very happy. This guy knows everything about you," and he didn't say it.
It's amazing.
And that was the way you had. That was the sort of position that was absolutely obligatory if you're going to live
to be with the people
in that kind of troubled space. And I was later on in pretty troubled space in Turkey too. And the way that I'd figured out how to get through Ireland was quite workable in the Turkish environment too. You can be courteous and decent to everybody without being committed. I'm not a Turk. I'm not Irish. I'm just some wacky American guy that's shown up here. And I don't have to be involved. I have to know, but I have to be able to write with sufficient elegance that none of the facts get through that are dangerous.
Yeah.
Not my job.
I want to read a piece from the preface to the book here, just to sort of, I suppose, convey or contextualize some of what you described here. This is from the preface to Passing the Time in Ballymenone. And you write, "Ballymenone is a small place of green hills, white homes and brown bog, lying by Upper Lough Erne in the county Fermanagh, 7 miles north and 9 miles east of the border breaking Ireland. Passing the time is what the people who live there say they are doing, when they work by day, following the cows up the grassy damp slopes, sweeping their kitchens clean, and it is what they say they are doing when they fill the night's length with stories that hold the mind away from danger. Passing the time is what they said I was doing when I worked beside them, sweaty on the meadows, asking too many questions about agricultural technology, and it is what they said I was doing when I recorded, again and again, every story they told. Like theirs, my work passed the time, consoling me, testing me, and like theirs, my story made me think and tied me, during its telling, into a web of responsibility. I owe my teachers, the people of Ballymenone, honesty and accuracy. I let their creations stand as they shaped them, but I accept more than their words and the work of their hands. I begin my tale with their categories, with night and day, caileying and farming, home, clay, moss, bog, talk, chat, and story, then push beyond, following their modes of reasoning to propose their world for contemplation within our own. Good work is not the end of our task. Scholars are citizens in debt to their society. Our study must push beyond things to meanings and grope through meanings to values. Study must rise to perplex and stand to become part of a critical endeavour. We study others so their humanity will bring our own into awareness, so the future will be better than the past. The others I studied and choose to describe to you do not occupy some misty island from distant days. They live in a hard corner of the same world you and I inhabit. Money is scarce there. Work is ceaseless. Their skies crack with storms and pound with bombs. Ulster. The sacred heart of their community has been split by political terror. Despite it all, they remain good people. We have much to learn from them. I'm really interested in what you write here in the context of a community experiencing violence, undergoing violence and trauma and so on, but also of the need of the folklorists to push beyond categories that you mentioned, starting with the categories and types and motifs. You mentioned like the shattered sort of glass that Sean O'Sullivan was interested in, or that the folklorists are often interested in, and genre, but to go beyond forms and things and into meanings. And so I suppose with that in mind, I'm wondering, I'm not sure if I can formulate this into a kind of clear question in particular, but I'm wondering if you could relate to us some of the ways in which the people of Ballymenone drew on those traditional forms, narratives, stories, custom songs, recitations, but also the material things, kitchens, fireplaces, houses, gates, roads, the ways in which they used those traditional forms to sort of orient themselves as a community and understand their reality. Or in a sense, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is what are the ways in which the people in Ballymenone, in your experience, were using their context or the past to navigate the anxieties of the present? Does that make sense?
Well, I think honestly, I was sort of pleased with having written that.
It's amazing.
I probably haven't read it for 20 years, and so reading it, you reading it aloud, caused me to say, that's pretty well right. That's pretty much how I think about it. And so then your question would be, what sense I made of it?
Yeah, of how the people in that place used the traditional forms that they're kind of the cultural expressions that they were surrounded by, how they used reference to those, reference to the past, reference to tradition, reference to, say, to folklore and folk life, to understand or to navigate the present, the fact of the bombs exploding in Enniskillen, without necessarily directly mentioning the present. Do you know what I mean? Using historical lore or narrative or song or land, the history of the land, to sort of situate themselves and endure the history that was bearing down on them, basically.
Well, I think that I want to give a serious answer. I think that you've just said it quite well. But what I think that was offered by the place to the people for survival was options for communication. So that different people chose different things to be good at.
Yeah.
And that was quite possible. And so then I could say that would make great sense to me. That is, there were certain people, men, who were known to be great farmers. They didn't necessarily have any position about violence. They didn't necessarily sing songs, but they had a way to go on. This is what they would have, that was their phrase, way of going on. So that a way of going on would be, some people chose, Tommy Love, for example, chose to be wonderful farmer. that was fulfilling. I mean, you would think outsider wouldn't think that necessarily that would be fulfilling, but absolutely fulfilling. Tommy Love built his own house, thatched his own house, farmed a very small plot, but that was such a complete thing for him that then he would show up in the Ceilidh, and in the Ceilidh there would be Peter Flanagan was a performer in the Ceilidh. And what he was a performer, he was a great singer. And so that he would sing a song in the thing. Tommy wouldn't sing any songs. He tried to play the fiddle a little bit, but he wasn't really very good at it. But what that world gave was a series of options for people's success. That's true, even though the success from the outside standpoint wouldn't seem very strong. Ellen Cutler was famous cook. Now, she didn't sing songs. She didn't really tell much in the way of stories. She had the history down very well. She was extremely interested in the ferries because she lived right next to a ferry Forth. And so that she drew from that Forth a real strong interest in fairy lore. And so she would talk to other people about fairy lore, and anybody that you would want to ask around in Ballymenone, who will tell you about the fairies, it would be Ellen Cutler, because she had actually done research. It's what I'm trying to do, and hadn't quite done it yet. It's exactly the same as your life and my life. There are options, and you chose some option that made sense to you. So that I chose options to become a folklorist because that was, I liked the old time music, really. That's what it was at the beginning. And then it became a whole lot of other things. I mean, the old time music in Appalachia didn't mean much to me when I was doing field work in Bangladesh, but I knew how to handle myself in Bangladesh too. So I don't think that's wrong. I think you'd think that a community, let's say it's not a very big community, and there's almost nobody. Bobby Thornton had money, but most people didn't have any money. So you'd think that those people would necessarily be in a kind of state of despair, but it's not true. They were able to find in the place where they live a sufficient interest for the active brain to keep going. Ellen Cutler was a cook. Peter Flanagan was no cook, but he was a singer. She also found him offensive because his grammar was so precise. I mean, that's just, she thought that he was kind of goofy for having such a big vocabulary. Peter Flanagan was an absolutely poor guy. He didn't own land. He was a farm laborer. He made his living by going around to other people's places and doing their farm work with them. I mean, Tommy Lunny's got a bigger farm than Peter Flanagan's got no farm at all. He's a laborer. But boy, oh boy, he cared tremendously about the language that he spoke. And so that he had a vocabulary that was probably 3 times anybody else's vocabulary in all of Ballymenone. That was interesting to him, but it was also an option. Did he have the option to own land? No, he didn't.
Yeah.
Did he have the option to play the fiddle well? Yes, he did. It was a little bit tough as his hands decayed. It was a little bit hard on him. I can understand that. Early in my life, I really enjoyed playing music, and my hands won't let me anymore. Just like Peter Flanagan, he had to realize, what am I going to do with my life? I'm going to get a big vocabulary. Ellen Cutler thought he was a horrible man because he was big. He spoke like he would swallow the dictionary. There's the 2 people. They figured out something by being in place. I'm not being sentimental now, I'm being absolutely accurate. By being in place, they had an option for fulfillment. Tommy Love bought a little piece of land. He built a house on it. He thatched the house on it. His house was beautiful. He had gardens. you'd look at Tommy's place and you'd say, this is just beautiful. I could live here. I mean, you couldn't live here if you're used to our amenities. I mean, there was no plumbing, no electricity. But you can make a beautiful house, and Tommy Love made a beautiful house. And Peter Flanagan didn't make a beautiful house. He made a kind of a ratty house, but he really had a terrific vocabulary. Hugh Nolan knew so much about the history. He studied with Huey McGevney. Huey McGevney was the great historian of his period. Huey McGevney was gone, but Hugh Nolan knew the history. So you want to know about the history, you go to Hugh Nolan. You want to hear a good song, go to Peter Flanagan. You want a good meal, go to Ellen Cutler's. All of them had seized in that little place with its kind of narrow grain and very, all the farms were very small. 4 acres was about normal, but you could make a living out of 4 acres of land. Possible. It's not possible if you're not a really good farmer, but if you're a really good farmer, you can do that work. So what I would say, I'm not being exactly sentimental, but what I would say, a place like Ballymenone, to say it in a general way, a place like Ballymenone with apparent tremendous limitations actually offers terrific depth for the person who's in place, who knows place. When Michael Boyle was dying in the hospital, and Michael Boyle, I visited him every week. When he was dying in the hospital, you know what he was doing, lying there with nothing? He was running through the sequence of people who had lived in different houses. And he just would lie there, not in Ballymenone, because he wasn't in Ballymenone. He was raised in Ballymenone. He lived in 2 different houses in Ballymenone, so they knew something about it. But he would lie in the hospital dying. It's that simple. And what he would do is he would go through this house and he would say, oh, that was owned by so-and-so, and before that somebody else lived there. He had figured out not the genealogy of families, but the genealogy of homes. And he would just run through that. I mean, if he didn't know that information, his time in the hospital would have been miserable. What am I going to do? But he also, to houses, certain stories were attached, and so that when I was recording everybody's stories, I mean, I really felt like my obligation was to record every single story that was told in Ballymenone, and I think I probably did it over 10 years. But Michael Boyle had a lot of stories to tell. You wouldn't think so. But he wasn't a great storyteller, but he knew the landscape, he knew the place, and he thought about the place, and he thought about the houses that were there, and he knew every family that lived there. Protestant, Catholic, didn't matter. And so would Hugh Nolan have known most of that information? Yes, but he would have inflected it differently into serious actual history, and so that he knew about warfare. Michael Boyle wasn't talking so much about warfare, he was talking about houses. Tommy Love wasn't talking about houses, he was building the house and making a beautiful house for his family. That's just true. And so I didn't find, here's what I'm driving at, I didn't find the limitations, the physical limitations, the spatial limitations, the conceptual limitations to be limitations at all. I found that for most people, being quite serious, they were opportunities. So, for example, William Lunny was the only Protestant that lived in the townland of Rosdoning. But he, with his neighbor, who was obviously a Catholic, he's the only Protestant, worked out a kind of warfare that made mockery of the whole Troubles. They would pretend to be enemies and then laugh and have a great time.
That's
They really, you know, you say, you know, he would go out on the place in front of the houses were very close, and he'd say, you Fenian bastard up on the hill, you know, who've you killed recently?
Mm-hmm.
And then the guy who was actually the mailman would come out and say, oh, you know, whore, Protestant whore, you know, what are you doing here? And then they'd laugh and laugh and laugh. I mean, it was they could get through. I'm attempting to exemplify the virtues of limitation.
Yeah.
And if you are, if you're a person who has wide horizons, then the wide horizons become exciting for you. But if you're just stuck there, most of the people were pretty poor, and they didn't travel. In the entirety of Ballymenone, there was one automobile. So you walk, and if you walk, you get to know the land really, really well.
Yeah.
When I have been back, you know, lots of times, and returning to Ballymenone because I've done it so often, people would say, "Oh, I remember you. You're the man that walks the lanes." See, I did it all by walking too. I realized that if you walked, I mean, it's something that Prof. Evans would have approved of. If you walk, you see it all, you feel it all, you feel the rise and pitch of the land. You begin to know what land is rich and what land is not rich. You begin to know a lot about that. You begin to know whose cows are whose. You begin to know whose dog is whose, because one of the things that happens is that dogs they get used to you, and then they run out to greet you. Oh, you know, the dog who's taking care of the farm is actually, once you're known, the dog is, you pet him. And so what I guess, to try to say something reasonable, I tried to understand the virtues of limitation. And it wasn't me inventing that. I could see that Peter Flanagan knew all these songs. People would go to his house. They wouldn't be musicians. They'd ask P, oh, sing The Blackbird. And he'd do it. You wouldn't, but you'd go to Hugh Nolan's, and you'd go to Hugh Nolan's because he knew all the landmarks that separated different homesteads in Ballymenone. And if there was a generation, the next generation comes along and isn't really sure, he'd say, well, just stand for such and such a tree, look to your right, and you'll find a stone. And that's the marker that we have. It was just people knew different things, and those different things made life not good, but sufficient to sustain humanity. I think that's pretty true.
It's amazing what it's setting up the thing, getting this traffic jam of thoughts from what you're saying. You reminded me there, Michael J mentions that when he said the man who walks the lanes in Tyrone Folkquest, I think he says that he was called the bungalow man who's after folklore, and the man who went after the fairies. He had these, that the community sort of have these very neat ways of
understand
and defining a person.
Yeah, if you're communicating properly in the place, they know what you want.
So what you were saying there reminds me, or brings me to, you're mentioning, I suppose, in the context of sort of the limitations that are placed on us by land, by space, time, sort of economics, history, culture, and so on, but that these can be used as departures into creativity. Often I'm thinking in the context of music. Often if it's when
Yeah,
when
I
something's
think
very limited, it forces
it's
it
not
forces.
sentimental. It's
Yeah, no,
true.
I fully I agree, and but it just reminded me of when you're mentioning Peter Flanagan a few times there, that you were saying that, otherwise, sort of without these things, that, for example, that a man dying in hospital might despair otherwise. And it brought me to, it made me think of my favorite piece in the book, which I want to read now. It's a sort of bold statement, but I think this is my favorite. It's one of my favorite sections in the book. And it relates particularly to Peter Flanagan, and to I suppose to the necessity that we have in life to endure, to not just to endure, but to sort of to be grateful, to have gratitude, and never to give in to despair, basically. So I want to read that now.
That's the goal. It
yeah.
isn't necessarily always met.
Yes, correct and true. Beyond the world in which people struggle for freshness and no decay, there is another of eternal freshness, joy, smoothness, brightness, a world of eternal will. The role is to carry on. The danger is despair. This is talking now to this is Hugh Nolan. Life is so hard. This mentions Hugh Nolan and Peter Flanagan. Life is so hard. It is a world of troubles at the present time, Mr. Nolan said, and not a solution for them. He also said, all has misfortunes, and we can take some comfort in being alive. Taking some comfort is brave, necessary, and realistic. There always is some consolation for hardship, P tells me. This is Peter Flanagan. Using his house as example. It is smoky, cold, dark. In the towns they have more comfort. They have electricity and central heat, and the racket of lorries and cars. In my own wee house I have the consolation of quiet. He can get up in the morning, he says, and stand out in the street, letting the music of 1,000 birds fill his ears. I feel the perfect silence around us. No electric hum, no creaking pipes or mumbling voices or distant whining engines, and I think back to our first meeting. My most exact and vital memory is of P tossing breadcrumbs toward the dresser for a tiny round brown bird on long thin legs who had hopped in over the threshold. Early this morning, while we sat with breakfast tea, a hen, a blue Andalusian, paused in the doorway, grey with the grey house before her and the grey of the day behind. She stood in motionless tension, one foot set forward on the concrete floor, her head poised before a pale, colourless sky, while her comb gathered and transmitted pure ruby light. I was stunned. A tiny point of brilliant red glowed within an overwhelming greyness. I felt a flash of understanding, a scarlet speck on a field of grey, the heart's glow in the dark interior, a moment of pleasure amid ceaseless work, hope within hardship. It is your choice to concentrate on the bright speck or lose yourself in darkness. P's life is so hard, but he loves the growing plants. His fingers are gentle around them when he lifts their leaves to the sun. In town he would lose touch with God's goodness, pressing itself in birdsong and green shoots through the cracks of the hard world. He would lose too, he tells me, his liberty. People like himself need space to develop their own way of going on, for musicians is curious. Were he jammed into the shove and hustle of the town, his spirit would be crushed. In the country, but not in the towns, P says, the old saying, many men, many minds, holds true. Mr. Nolan talked similarly. When he was in the hospital recently, they treated him well, but scorched him with steady heat, making it hard to readjust to the drafts in his house. They want him to move to a home for the aged. But no, he told me, as I draped another overcoat over his shoulders and busied with our tea at the hearth. There he would have to live by their rules and would lose the freedom that is his consolation. It is hard sometimes to rise. It is a long walk on an uneven floor between the jagged furniture from the hearth to the dresser. But he knows the route. In these surroundings he has learned to do battle with the night's empty length. He has neighbours to help him and he refuses to be taken away. Life is uncertain and hard, but if people lose God into the vastness of the unknown, if they lose the will to discover consolation amid pain, the bright flash against darkness, they will still into an action. they despair. Above all things, P tells me, it is your personal responsibility to prevent that happening. You can't let yourself think that God doesn't love you. Then you are lost. When lost, he explains, you lose connection with law, by which he means God's law, cosmic order. All laws, physical, spiritual, social, fuse into one law. When people lose touch with its center, God's particular love for them, law disassembles into laws. Laws proliferate, become intricate, trivial, and thought staggers into disorder as people, forgetting their relation to God, lose their connection to nature and their fellow creatures. They fall into despair, a state of hopelessness in which they are useful neither to God, themselves, or their neighbours. Hardship, P says, tempts us to despair. But we must be brave. We cannot contemplate suicide, but must endure. If you work to endure, P tells me, with the house black around us and the record of past struggles eaten into his memory, God will reward your courage, even if you are a bad sinner. Despair is the worst, the very worst. Life is hard, but it must be lived. We must carry on. God knows life's hardships. He understands the temptation to despair, but he knows the gallant effort to keep going. We must carry on, is the last line. I think that's my favorite, most impactful sort of part in this text, in the book. And it's that image of the flash, the sort of flash against the darkness, the I suppose the necessity in the context of, in Hugh Nolan's life and Peter Flanagan's life and in all of our lives, of a sort of, I suppose, the difficulties, the struggles, a traumatized and sort of community in Ballymenone, or a sort of one in the experience of violence and trauma. But the choice that exists in that context, and the way in which, like you were saying, that people sort of find a way within themselves, within a sort of communal framework, a way of going on, in a way where the individual finds expression in a communal form. And that sort of, the descriptions in that, I suppose, lead me in a way to think, one thing that you said when we were chatting earlier there was that that for the person in place, that these things are an option. And what that suggests to me, or what it implies or makes me think of in a way, is like in the context of, say, contemporary experience in many ways, where you talk about, and elsewhere in the book, sort of that motion is essential to simplified history, I think is the line, that, and not mobility in the context of sort of moving physically from space to space, but a sort of, in an age where increasingly characterized by sort of dislocation, by the breaking down of the tapestries that sort of weave together and form these traditional ties that bind, say. What do you think, what can we do today to ameliorate some of those difficulties for those who are not in place, who feel dislocated in community and society? What are the sort of forms that we can refer to or use to navigate that as an experience? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. How do we do that when we're not in place, when we're say, operating against the backdrop of sort of cultural artificiality or decay, or it was mentioned somewhere else, the sort of the in Michael Jay's opening text about the sort of the shallowness of contemporary values and so on. Is there some way that does folklore offer a frame into which people can sort of enter, to draw on the past, to sort of, say, find ways to kind of carry on, or inspiration and joy and so on, or what do people who are not in place do in order to, how do they go on?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. If I did, I'd probably be semi-divine. But what I guess I would sort of skirt that by saying, one of the things that we folklorists do is find those answers as performed by actual people. That is, I can tell you, look, would anybody reading that book wish to live the life of Peter Flanagan? The answer is no. Would they maybe learn a little bit from that model? Possibly. And what they would do is find what for them is like music is for P. That's not a bad possibility. But the trouble is that if you allow too many, I mean, I'm talking about us, if we allow too many alternatives in, then we never ground ourselves in what really matters.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I don't think that's false. And so that I could say that would be not only would that be true for the people of Ballymenone, who all of us would think were impoverished.
Yeah.
And would be dismissible for that reason. They're all impoverished. They're all desperate. They all don't have meat to eat. They all have all these terrible problems, but are terrible problems that are constructed by us for them, rather than going inside and understanding what things matter for them. So one of the things that I don't have a good answer to your wonderful question. I would just say that one of the things that I have found in what amounts now to a pretty long life, the options for success are enormous. I mean, really, go to different places and find out what makes things work for them. That's really quite possible. And what we can do conceivably through folklore is to suggest some of the options that people have actually found in the world. And I would, here's not a bad example. One of the things that I was certainly concerned about when I was in Ballymenone was that Ellen Cutler was a kind of a star, but there were some women that did not seem like stars, and seemed to me weren't enjoying the cooking of food. I mean, these are kind of things, you're stuck. Ellen Cutler is stuck. She's got to be in the house, but she is very house proud. She keeps the place spotless. She does a beautiful job of it. Her son's wife, when she died and he moved into that house, hated it. All those things that made so much for Ellen Cutler, and she wasn't faking. I didn't make her up. She was herself. And the house was spotless. It was beautiful. She preserved the old things she had a real, seriously valuable antique clock. Well, probably made in Northern Ireland, probably around 1830. She took care of that clock, kept it running. Her son moves in. What did he do? Took that very valuable clock out, threw it on the street, and chopped it up with an axe. He hated that stuff. See, the same symbol that was very positive for her son Dick, we saw him pretty recently, and he's bitter. He thought that all those things that I'm now approving of in the life of Ellen Cutler were a kind of slavery, because he looks at what they got. Ellen Cutler had the first television in that community. They got the TV to look at, trying to sell you stuff all the time. So that's not an answer, but it is an answer to the problem that we have, that the alienation from life's experiences have created a desperation. I would think so. And I don't think that, all the existentialists had nailed this down in place a long time before. But what I wanted to provide an example that was accurate. I was concerned in Ballymenone that I didn't really feel like I got next to some of the women. I was there for a long time. It's not like I didn't know these people.
Yeah.
But I don't feel that I don't feel that what I've written and written with certain energy accurately captured the life of all the women in the place. I don't think so. Hugh Patrick Owen's wife was great. She's like Ellen Cutler. She's a terrific cook. She was full of fun, energetic. And every one of her daughters left Ballymenone and went to London. In other words, she adjusted, and she was a very smart woman, and she adjusted, and she was happy there with it, smoky hearth and all that stuff. Not her daughters. They left. They all went. And there was no woman in Ballymenone who was born in Ballymenone and who was older than 18 or younger than 45. They left. I mean, they just voted with their feet.
Yeah.
And so how did people find, how did men, successful men, find mates? They went to Catholic mixers in big cities and found women who just thought living in the countryside sounds like a dream. I'm living in a slum. And so that there was an input, there was a kind of a pouring in that is, young women in Ballymenone got the hell out. But there were young women in the big cities who had enough experience of urban life to think Ballymenone was a kind of a dream.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not wrong. So, I mean, it's a little schematic, but I don't think it's an incorrect generalization. It worried me. It worried me. And then the next thing, 10 years in Ballymenone, the next thing that happened to me is 10 years in Turkey. God, to be a Turkish woman. They weave, they have all this art, all this crafts, all these things that keep them going. They love it. There's among the same economic level, countryside Turkey, the women are happy. I mean, I'm leaving Ballymenone and the women don't look happy to me. And I went to Turkey, and why? They had craft. They're weaving carpets. They could make two young women sitting together side by side could weave a carpet in 2 weeks that would bring them the same amount of money that a laboring man in the city would make in about 3 months. They were rich. They were wealthy. Well, that wealth is trivial, but pride is not. And so one of the things that happened to me is that I'm speaking, that is the concern that I had that was, I didn't solve it, but the concern that I had for the problems of younger women in Ballymenone, I was sympathetic, but that when Pat's daughter stood in the doorway and said, I'm 18 tomorrow. I'm getting the hell out of this place. I'm going straight to London and getting a job in the transport business. That's what the young women did. They got jobs in big cities in London, in England, and made some money and didn't feel foolish about it. And so they had pride. And then very often they married in England, frequently black people, and brought them back. And so there was this kind of second generation. I mean, later on in Ballymenone, if you keep on following the story, it doesn't The book is before the story was ended. But what I saw was really very interesting. This kind of black guys from the Caribbean would go to London and find these pretty Irish ladies, and then they would have really lovely little mixed children. That was, I mean, that's beyond the story, but I kept up. And so that then one of the things, I hope I'm being clear, the next big fieldwork project for me was Turkey. And it was really conditioned by my experience in Ballymenone, in that I went straight to the women and found out what was making them good. They had their own money. If their father wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes, he had to ask his teenage daughter for the money because she's making these carpets. And there was something that was so, I mean, it was like a kind of possible symmetry. You know, I would like to be a Irish man, and I'd like to be a Turkish woman. I mean, really, just I'm being serious. And so that really 10 years of fieldwork in Turkey, I mean, I got good at the language and everything, but that I featured the women. And I found a place, you see, that young women really were, I mean, they were proud and they were strong and they were tough because they had good money and they had the skill of carpet weaving. That's a little bit dopey, but it's not wrong. It's a kind of sequence of things that can be done when you're an ethnographer, the which I am. I can set up a problem in a community, and so that I come into Ballymenone, and what can I say? I find the virtue of Ballymenone. And the virtue of Ballymenone is the small space can be really rich if you have a commitment to it.
Yeah.
The farmer. And then bounce around the world a little bit, and I can actually look for and find a place that solves the problem that I have as an ethnographer in concern with gender.
I'm wondering, from a few things you've said sort of throughout our conversation here, I'm thinking of just totally drawing a blank there. What was the point you'd made earlier on? Yeah, I was asking about for people who are not in place, say, in the sort of options in terms of cultural forms and sort of the idea of constellation. Do you think in Ireland, maybe there's a couple of things from the start of our conversation. Sean O'Sullivan, you mentioned it being interested in these sort of fragmentary, the kind of glass, the bits. And I'm thinking of the Delargy's preface to the Handbook of Irish Folklore, where he talks about the shoddy and imported culture of the towns. There's nothing there, and there's nothing in Fermanagh, and there's nothing in the towns. Do you think that in Ireland today, that I sometimes feel that there's a sense of this in Ireland, that it's sort of, that there can be sometimes an atmosphere that this is all in the past, but that actually sometimes people here, we ourselves often can't see it. Like, I'm interested in that idea that Sean O'Sullivan, for all his sort of greatness and skill in terms of the work here, that he couldn't see, that he would say, don't bother going to Fermanagh or something like that. Do you think that there's, I suppose, something that we here can't see about our own cultural conditions that maybe you were able to, because like you said at the start, you didn't have to commit to either side, you could simply be with the people, and that allows you a sort of to actually see what often they can't, like the priest said, that he this guy knows everything about you. Do you think that it takes, for want of a better word, maybe an outsider's perspective, an outside view, to see something clearly, to see a people clearly?
Well, I think if that weren't true, that the ethnographer's business would be foolish. It's a matter of time. I don't walk into Peter Flanagan's house and figure that out.
Yeah.
I lived with Peter. I slept in his house. I knew exactly what he and Joe, how they lived. And it didn't depress me once I got inside. I mean, Peter Flanagan was a terrific musician. And that was his salvation. And there's a terrific salvation, it seems to me, and very great powers of gender balance in seeing how things work in Turkey. Young women have money. If father wants this pack of cigarettes, he goes to her, and there's a sort of power that's there. And honestly, there's the same kind of power I would have think I didn't. I'm not misleading other people. Hugh Nolan, miserable little black house. His house had 2 rooms. He only lived in one of them. He was a sick old man, but he just glowed when he was telling the history of. And I can remember one of my, way back, one of my daughters came and sat with me. They all got to know everybody. So one of my daughters, she was old, maybe she was about 9, and she sat at the hearth and listened to Hugh Nolan tell about a battle that had taken place in the late 16th century in not in Balymena, but to the west. And little girl said, "Boy, if they told us history like that at school, I'd love it." I mean, she was completely wrapped up.
Yeah.
And the same thing would be true well, what I'm saying very clearly is the men in the Turkish village have their virtues and they're agricultural. They don't really understand how brilliant their daughters are. But you spend time, in other words, this is a little bit of an answer to the question, is this something that the outsider can see? I think so. If you're patient and you're an outsider and you come in, it's surprising how deeply you can get that people will really talk to you. I mean, maybe a couple of times in Turkish villages, I set up the tape recorder and I just asked people to kind of free-form tell me about the experience of learning how to make these, beautiful carpets. But they were unbelievably excited. This is an opportunity. What's the opportunity? That guy's a man. We can tell a man what's going on in here that they never pay attention to. I think that's a reality. So that you could, if you didn't sit with, there was a very nice nurse that would come and visit Hugh Nolan once a week, and she would she'd smell the smoke, she'd see the blackness, she'd see the kind of misery, and was full of sympathy. That's not what you do with Hugh Nolan. You'd say, this is the great historian of this place, and this guy can really tell the stories. And my little daughter sat with him and said, "Whoo, boy, if we were taught history that well, what an exciting story was told about this thing that happened in 1590.
Yeah. It's interesting when you're describing, I suppose, the sort of, just as you say, that the view that the outside perspective can reveal, or that the panorama that can be revealed from both outside and within a community. by someone in a way who's not, as you were saying at the start of our conversation here, someone who's not sort of explicitly committed to either side in a way. And you had mentioned it at the opening of our conversation about that you didn't come to Ireland initially in the context of a sort of sentimental, genealogical sort of family, which is not even to denigrate that for people who do. But
that's a real thing for a lot of people.
And yet, you were saying that later on that you did sort of have this through a great uncle that discovered that there was this ancestry here. And I suppose I want to sort of move towards finishing up our conversation, and to thank you so much for your time and for sharing your time and your insights with us. And I just want to read two pieces, one from yourself and one from Michael J. And I'll start with Michael J. here, again from a Slieve Gullion's Foot. And I think in ways it sort of encapsulates, there's a resonance here with your own work, I think. At the start of this, at Slieve Gullion's Foot, Michael J. writes about the old house, and he says, "There were 3 houses on this slope, 2 still inhabited, 1 a ruin. It is not so long since I helped to restore the centre one. The whole point in my narrating this little incident is that it was a symbolic coincidence that the house should have been the last Irish-speaking place in the parish. I did not learn that, however, until after a family had moved into it, until the young descendants of the old strain were dancing Irish reels to the music coming over a radio set. The whole set of circumstances accompanying that revelation made the night a memorable and inspiring one. It struck me as a portent that laughing children should be dancing there when the late Patrick Carney, who was on his céilí, revealed a fact which made it almost historic. I was glad that night that I had unwittingly helped to restore more than a home. No one had believed it would ever again be habitable. The kitchen had been slated, but water ran through channels cut in the earthen floor. The walls were cracked and rapidly decaying. Grass grew inside, and a heap of rubble marked the old fireside. The thatched room had collapsed. God bless you. And the thatch, rotting like dung, nourished a flourishing boar tree, a few other shrubs, and masses of weeds and nettles. The chilly, damp smell of decay was everywhere, even in a scringing loch. But a feeling which went deeper than Irish family pride in the house of their fathers evidently kept the house from being casually used as a cattle shelter. No whitewash went on the walls. In a few years it would be referred to as so-and-so's old walls. The reasons behind its restoration were, let me say, plainly economic and materialistic, the normal urge of a person aiming to improve his position in life. Now I realised that it took an admirable amount of courage to tackle the job. However, the emotions behind the undertaking are best imagined. God bless you. I need not describe in detail the actual process of restoration except to state that no tradesman was employed. I helped as a labourer. We were making again the external shell of that magic and contented place called home." And then from the preface to your own book. "Ballymenone is split, and no one could find both its sides equally easy to know, but I was lucky to be foreign enough to be removed from the local divisions, so I could meet everyone cordially, and yet I was not so alien as to be beyond welcome and intimate conversation. I have both Catholic and Protestant ancestors. Though raised a Protestant and culturally still one, I suppose, religion is not a part of my life. I'm not Irish or even Irish American. My ancestors are Irish from both north and south, but they are English as well, and Scottish. Some in Ballymenone correctly recognised the Gaelic word for green within the Highland Scots name, Glassie. Between my second and third trips to Ballymenone, my great-uncle discovered that his family, my father's mother's family, the Caffreys, lived in Fermanagh, near Enniskillen, before joining the great sweep of early 18th century migration from Ulster through Pennsylvania into the upland interior of the south. So when a man I did not know met me in a pub in Enniskillen and asked me the usual question about my ancestry, I could say for the first time that some of my people came from his country. It was strange, I said, how I felt immediately comfortable in those low hills, made friends easily, and only later learned that some of my ancestors came from this very place. I would feel the same shock of comfort years later when I got to know the North Devon countryside that my mother's people left in the early 18th century. My thought was that those first settlers sought familiar country, hilly and open, then turned it more familiar through work. I grew to feel at home in such surroundings, so when I returned to their homeland in Ulster and Devon, rolling green farmland like Pennsylvania and Virginia, I felt at once at ease. My drinking companion listened patiently to my story. Dogs, he said, are taken away and they always come back. Salmon return every year from the wide sea to the same mountain stream. If a fish can find its way home, he said, surely a man can. He looked at me as if I were the most witless of fools, took a drink and said, sure, a man can find his way home. So, Henry, it's a great privilege to be able to sit and speak with you here today. Not just in celebration of your conferral from the university here in recognition of your life's work, but also to be here in this space and to call to mind the work of all of those who have gone before us, who have laboured like yourself in various ways and to various degrees in this field. So thank you so much, and for your patience and your time with me today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here. So, and thanks everyone for listening as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. There was a lovely conclusion, and so that you don't have to have me still talking.
Please do.
But what I think is interesting is that you picked out the very books that inspired me. That is to say, I had read, before I ever came to Ireland, I'd read Evans, I'd read Sean O'Sullivan. Indeed, I'd written a review of Sean O'Sullivan's Folktales of Ireland before I'd ever seen Ireland. And these are books that I read. Michael J. Murphy. I mean, I was so excited to meet Michael J. And we hit it off really well. And Michael J. was there. I mean, these things were all before I ever had gotten to Ireland. Before I'd ever gotten out of the United States, really. I had read Prof. Evans, and I'd read Sean O'Sullivan, and I'd read Michael J. Murphy. You've done a beautiful job, it seems to me, of snatching out of the fullness of of the library the books that really, I mean, I read those, and they were all inspirational to me.
Thank God, brilliant.
I mean, those were my inspirations before. I mean, I hadn't met Michael J., but I had met Sean O'Sullivan, and I had met Eston Evans. I mean, when I was 18 or something like that.
Yeah. No, I'm delighted. It's a huge honor and a pleasure, and I'm glad, I suppose, that that I had the right instinct in this regard. Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Cheers.
It was great.
Delighted.
You did a lot of work in preparation, but it was lovely to hear.
That was easy. Delighted. Thanks a million. Thanks a lot. Slán. Right. Cheers.